the moment of truth, our keynote speaker, he flew down from Wisconsin to help us understand this monstrosity that we're facing called Common Core. So, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Pesta. He's received his MA in Renaissance Literature from John Carroll University and his PhD in Shakespeare and Renaissance Literature from Purdue University. He has taught at major research institutions and has been active in alerting the public on the state of education in America and solution to its problems. Developing and implementing an elective Bible course that is currently available for public high school students in Texas. He's professor of English at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh, and academic director of Freedom Project Education. I had the privilege of driving down with him, bringing him from Jacksonville to Daytona to speak to us, and I have the highest respect for the man. So please give Dr. Pesta a very warm welcome.
And thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate that. It's a beautiful Saturday here. I guess they all are in Daytona. But this is a nice one. So I'm glad you're here. We are going to give you a really good overview of Common Core. We're going to give you, one of the things I think people keep inviting me to speak is because every week we update our slides. Every week we add new stuff. There's always something new going on in Common Core, and after 3 years of doing this, I can tell you, everything we said was going to happen 3 years ago when they laughed, when they mocked, when your own Jeb Bush made his ridiculously snide remarks about people who oppose Common Core, everything we've said is coming true. And we have the evidence for it today. Everything they tell you about Common Core, and I've told you for the last 3 years, and I can say this now, we now know, they weren't ignorance, they weren't misdirection, they were flat-out lies. So what I want to do is, I'm going to use today to really explode all the myths of Common Core, 5, 6 top myths, because when you cut through that, there's nothing left. The myth that Common Core was state-led. The myth that governors did this. That it was democratic, that teachers had a role to play in this. The myth that it's just a set of standards, it's not curriculum. All of these really, really imposing lies. The myth that it was rigorous, that Common Core has been tested. How do you know? How could you have said for 6 years that Common Core is rigorous, it's better than what we have, when it's only being tested in 44 states right now? Most of American kids are just now taking their first Common Core test the last couple weeks. And if you're only testing the kids now, how do you know it's better? How do you know it's rigorous? The lies behind this are pretty staggering, but we know, as we've heard from people in the past, that the biggest lies are the ones people believe. The lies you repeat again and again and again, the bigger the lie, the more people are likely to believe it. And the only reason Common Core has succeeded, the only reason it's here, is because we have far too many Americans who aren't paying any attention. As you said, as demographics shift, as priorities shift in the country, we're not paying much attention to where the power base lies, to who's doing what. And you know, some of this is the old panem et circenses, right? The old Roman bread and circuses. The idea that we keep, despite all the crises, despite all the made-up controversies, despite the riots and the shuttering of Walmarts from coast to coast, besides all of the militaristic operations that are going on in American cities, behind all this other stuff, there's still enough, it's a testament to how great America is, that there is still so much freedom and opportunity, and so much relative wealth, that people don't have to pay attention. That's our problem, right? That bad things are happening, they're undermining and transforming our liberties and freedoms, and there is enough wealth, opportunity, and power in this country left that the vast majority of us don't have to pay any attention. But we know, the fact that you're here today tells us that you know that sooner or later, as the noose tightens, the cost of all of this is going to go way up for us. So let me start by going through Common Core pretty thoroughly, and what we'll do is we will look at the myths and lies. The people who did this to you don't explain themselves. So other thing I like to say as I begin, every piece of information you're going to see here today is documented. As a professor, I can't just say things that aren't true. I can't just say Common Core is rigorous, and that's that. I have to show you, if I say it's not, I have to show you how. So every piece of information here today is documented, and I will put up, I packed everything except, you know, summer clothes to come down here. And I forgot to pack my business cards. So I'm dressed for Wisconsin weather and I have no business cards. Hardly an auspicious start. But at the end of the talk, I will put up on the screen here a website that has my email address. You can have all of this information for free. You just email me and I will mail you the entire presentation you're going to see today. And you'll have all that documented evidence. You don't know me. I don't ask you to trust me. In fact, I would prefer you didn't. I would prefer all of us start not trusting anybody until we know what they say. You know, I believe a very wise prophet, more than a prophet, once said, judge them not by what they say, but by what you see them do. So if we elect your state, you changed your constitution. You don't have an electoral vote now for who your superintendent of public schools are. You just changed that so that the governor gets to appoint that. Think about that for a second. Your governor gets to decide who's going to run education in the state without consulting you. Right? And so that's a problem. We trust people. Superintendent of public schools, my principal, my school says it's this and that. Don't trust people. It's enough that you're going to listen to me today, and I thank you for that. Take the information for free. Verify it. Go ahead. You should look at every piece of information I send you. You should verify it. Because I've done now about 400 talks in 40 states over the last 2.5 years. And no one's ever yet written back to me, not the Southern Poverty Law Center, not any of these hostile people. They've never written back and said, you know, that wasn't true. It is true. Take the information, look into it yourself, and if it is true, then the question is, what are you going to do about it? You're here, that's great, but we've got to get more, I mean, look at all the empty seats. We've got to get a lot more people listening to this message, or else it's going to be too late. And because once the feds consolidate this, and I suppose the good news is, they're 4 or 5 years, maybe even a decade, away from being able to completely consolidate their hold over public education. But that's where they're headed. And if you think about where we are now and where we were 20 years ago, you would never have imagined we could have gotten here so quickly. 20 years ago, you never would have thought you had American public schools teaching 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds about transsexualism. You would never in a million years, 20 years ago, have thought that all public schools would be equipping themselves with gender-neutral bathrooms for elementary school kids who claim to be the opposite sex. You never would have imagined that. And yet here we are. It's starting to go downhill now, right? And the thing one of the things I think you'll be gratified about, it is horrifying and gratifying, is how many people I'm going to show you, how many of the people who did this, who I'm going to present slides from, you'll see video clips, they're not even pretending anymore. They're not even trying to hide what they do. On the one hand, that shows us how much they've consolidated their power. On the other hand, it shows us just how absolutely brazen they are about it. So we should no longer have any illusions. This is not conspiracy theory stuff. This is not the stuff of tinfoil hats. As far as Common Core goes, you'll see a half a dozen people who did this to you, telling you exactly what they did, in spite of what Jeb Bush says. You know who's going to come out looking really foolish in all of this? Jeb Bush. And your superintendent of schools, and all the politicians, including the numerous Republican politicians who have capitulated to this because they're afraid of Governor Bush, who have, you guys just passed a really bad bill, a really bad one. You had a good one. That bill was sent to committee. You had people sponsor a really good Common Core bill. You even got a Democrat to sponsor that bill. Well, precisely for the purpose of labeling it, stalling it in committee, and letting it die. And you replace that bill, and it was the Republicans who pushed it through and voted for it, who passed a bill that is going to do nothing but reinforce the infrastructure of Common Core. And this, after being told 7, 8, 10 months ago, I was told the same thing in Wisconsin. Go ahead, elect the governor again. Go ahead. You want to get rid of Common Core, put more Republicans in the Senate and the Assembly. We did exactly that in Wisconsin. And the very first thing and I hate to say this, Governor Walker is still probably the most conservative governor in the country, and yet we can't get him to remove Common Core. He doesn't want it gone. Not because he likes. Unlike your governor, former Governor Jeb Bush, who's advocated for Common Core, who gets in people's faces about how wonderful it is for people who oppose Common Core. Governor Walker never did. He wasn't governor when Common Core came to Wisconsin. And when we push him, he says the right things. We can do better than Common Core. We can go beyond Common Core. But we gave him a legislature and a Senate that are dominated by Republicans. They want to write a bill to kill it. And he won't let me. Why? Because he wants to go to Washington. And everybody in Washington wants Common Core. And this is the reality that we face. I want you to know as we begin, when it comes to things like Common Core, or immigration for that matter, immigration reform, there aren't two parties anymore. You do not have two political parties. You have one. Boehner and his colleagues, the Jeb Bushes of the world, in fact, can you name one Democrat state governor who has loudly proclaimed the value of Common Core over the last 2 years? I can't think of one. I've never seen one on the news. I've never heard one state governor come out adamantly defending Common Core who's a Democrat. Not one. But I can give you 24 times Jeb Bush has done it. Chris Christie's done it. John Kasich in Ohio, a couple months ago, came out and ridiculed anybody who opposes Common Core on the right as tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists who just need to shut up and quit embarrassing the Republican Party. That's what you're getting from your Republicans on this. And so, when it comes to this kind of reform, partisanship has its place, obviously in many respects. And the reason Democrats don't support this much, it's not because they become more conservative than the Republicans, it's just because they won. They've got it. Right? Big government progressive types, they have no problem with Common Core. And they don't have to defend it because illegally and through all sorts of backdoor channels it became the law of the land. And so you see our constitutional system of government is being end-run. The doctor mentioned how you're going to have possibly as many as 9 million, who knows how many million new voters in 2016. Now, who knows, right? And that's one of the consequences here of not having a coherent immigration policy and allowing a rogue president to basically just invite non-legal citizens in, put them on American planes that your taxpayer money is paying for, flying them to strategic cities all over the country so they can vote in those elections. Those immigrants, the legal and otherwise, are being used as pawns. By all means, as the good doctor said, I oppose illegal immigration too, but we have to come to the realization that your government is inviting them in. Remember a couple years ago we learned that the federal government was advertising in Latin American and Central American country newspapers how to come to America and get food stamp benefits? We were advertising. The Department of Agriculture was taking out advertisements in foreign countries' newspapers telling those citizens how they could come here and get food, inviting them. At some point, you have to not blame the immigrants anymore. Right? You've got to blame the federal government who are using these people as pawns. And now, they're using your children as pawns too. Right? It's one thing to import tens of millions of people from foreign countries who will vote the way you want them to. That's nice. It's not as nice as taking 60 million American school kids and from kindergarten beginning to re-educate them so they will perpetually vote the way you want them to. All these issues are related. And so I like to start very broadly. What is Common Core? Again, for everybody out here, Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards for English and math. Science is forthcoming, all the other stuff. In fact, it's funny. The Common Core Committee is expanded, and yet Common Core standards are still being written. Nobody knows exactly by whom. It's the Department of Education. Now that you, Florida, agreed to accept English and math, that's what you agreed to, you're going to get all the rest of them too, even though nobody's asking you anymore. The feds are legally obligated to come back to you every time they put something else in and say, do you want this? But they're not. Because you took English and math, you're getting the rest of them. And the Common Core people are slippery this way. They've renamed the coming standards because you don't like the words Common Core. Even the vast majority of American moms who aren't paying any attention, who have too much to do on the beaches today, and I understand that they've got kids in volleyball, I get it. But the vast majority of American moms and dads who can't really be bothered to think much about this, they hate it too. When you ask them, a recent Gallup poll survey said about 75% of American families want to see it gone, even though probably there's less than 10% of American families even know what it is. So they're just changing the name. So for instance, they're putting the science standards now, they're slowly feeding them into your classroom, and they've changed the name to the Next Generation Science Standards. So they're warping this, right? So making it harder for you to trace it. And let me go jump real quickly. Here's the actual copyright to Common Core. And you know, the first big lie of Common Core that they want you to believe is that it's state-led. That's why they call them the state standards. That lets you think, right, that there's been a lot of local control going on here. Various states have all worked on this, they've worked together. This is truly a democratic effort. Well, but there's no evidence for it. It didn't happen. The states weren't consulted about this. The legislatures, no state legislature voted to take Common Core. The state took it. Sometimes the legislature confirmed that well after the fact. Most cases it didn't. Your governors really weren't consulted about this. In my state, Wisconsin, Governor Walker didn't choose this. It was his department, the person in charge of the Department of Public Education did it. Same thing in New York. The idea that, certainly you know moms and dads weren't consulted, teachers unions weren't consulted. There's nothing democratic and there's certainly nothing state-led about this. Take a look at what gets me. For 6 years you've been told this is state-led. Your own Governor Bush keeps pushing this lie, and yet their own copyright says it wasn't. Who did it? These two groups, the NGA Center and the CCSSO, shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and the sole developers of the how can they even call them Common Core state standards? In their own copyright, they don't even mention the states. They call them the state standards, even though they acknowledge that these two Washington lobbyist groups wrote them. That's really remarkable, isn't it? But you know why they do that. Why do they call the Affordable Care Act affordable? I mean, nobody believed it 8 years ago, and nobody believes it now. Not even the government believed it, but when they give, why did they name you? Because you don't have Common Core, you're reassured, right? You have the Sunshine State Standards. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, Sunshine is even a more rosy term than Common Core, and that's what they do. All right, whenever government is doing things it shouldn't do, it's giving them really cheery, happy names. I joke that if you get rid of Common Core tomorrow, they'll just roll it back in 3 years and call it something like happy, happy, joy, joy education. And then when you object, they'll say things to you like, you're not against joy, are you? All right, this is how they do it. And yet, they wouldn't keep doing it again if the vast majority of our American moms and dads go along with it. Okay, well, who could be against? We want things in common, right? Common means equal, doesn't it? That's what we want. No, common means low, right? People forget that the other definition of common is ununique, bland, right? Ordinary. We don't want ordinary kids. We don't want an education system that's going to stop the kids who care, who try, who want to succeed from succeeding, and replacing it with a forced down, top-down system that will make every kid the same kid. That's what this is. That's what they mean by common. And so their own copyright belies the idea that the states had anything to do with this. So who did it? Well, you got the two groups. The National Governors Association and the Chief Council of State School Officers. Council of Chief State School Officers. And I know when you hear the name, that's what they'll say. But it's either got the NGA, that's the governors. No, it's not. You go to the NGA's website. It is basically a trade organization. It's a lobbyist group. The purpose of the National Governors Association is to put lobbyists and activists into contact with politicians and their aides in order to be able to move policy. It's advocacy. It's people peddling influence. It has nothing to do necessarily with governors agreeing on anything. In fact, one of the more interesting facts about Common Core, people forget that the sitting chair who was governor of the NGA for a significant time when Common Core was being implemented was Mary Fallin, the governor of Oklahoma. And about a year ago, Mary Fallin pulled Oklahoma completely out of Common Core. And one of the reasons she said she did it was because the states weren't consulted. So the governor in charge of the NGA pulled her state out of Common Core, saying that nobody consulted us. And yet your governor will argue that the governors did this. Where? Oh, and by the way, I honest to God wish 50 state governors locked themselves in a room and banged out education standards. Now, is your Governor Scott qualified to write education standards? My Governor Scott Walker's not. Governor Moonbeam in California certainly isn't. There's not a governor in the country who's qualified to write education standards. Not one. So why do I wish they had done it? Because you can always unelect a governor. You have some democratic representation, don't you? The people who did this, judging from the copyright, how do you get at these people, Florida? Moms and dads across the state are deciding in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. They don't want this. So how do you get at them now? How do you get at two Washington lobbyist groups who have no democratic access, who've never been elected to anything, You can't. The word I use for this is banana republic stuff, right? This is the kind of stuff that goes on in third world tin pot dictatorships, where unelected, unappointed, unrepresentative committees, people who nobody's ever heard of, who have no real authority, craft this stuff outside of legislative process, get it put in, and you have nothing to do with this. This is an end run around your constitutional government, right? Shouldn't surprise you. The last 8 years, the last 6 years have certainly been all about this, but this goes well before. Let's not lay all this at the feet of 2008, because this has been going on in American education for 40, 50 years. You know when this started, really? When this end running of state and local control started, when we created the Department of Education. We managed to educate kids in this country really quite well for 200 years. I mean, we put a man on the moon. Think about it for a second. We put a man on the moon. We educated the generation that did that with less technology than you have in the cell phones in your pockets. It's a remarkable achievement. And we did that without a Department of Education. Most of the kids, for the most duration of America's history, most kids in this country have been educated in one-room schoolhouses, where you had 3rd graders and 8th graders and 11th graders all doing the same, in the same school, studying at different levels. One teacher. That's local control. That's absolute control of the classroom. Those are the standards at work. And yet we create the Department of Education in the late 1970s for no reason. And isn't it interesting that you can really begin to trace in serious ways the decline of American education to that central bureaucracy? Because the first thing the Department of Education did was had to justify its own existence. All the money that originally went right from the federal government to the states to help with education, now it all had to funnel through the Department of Education. And as any big government organization does, it had to figure out how to hold on to as much of that money as possible for its own ends. We've never had an incident at the Department of Education, and yet the Department of Education has its own highly paid SWAT team at the Department of Education that you're paying for. Never use them. They just kind of sit around playing cards all day. But in case there should ever arise a problem, you can't use the regular authorities. The Department of Ed has its own SWAT team. And so you see what happened there. And so if we go back, these two Washington lobbyist groups, and even that's not right. Sure, those two lobbying groups are the front entities for the standards, but nobody in them really wrote them. There are 5 people primarily responsible for Common Core. There was help along the way at various points, but 5 main individuals. And if you, I see some of you are writing stuff down, you should write down the name of Joy Pullman, P-U-L-L-M-A-N, because you can find her article online. Joy has written a definitive article on the 5 people who wrote Common Core. The 5 main movers and shakers. In fact, the chief architect of Common Core, the main person responsible, is a guy by the name of David Coleman, C-O-L-E-M-A-N. The liberal Huffington Post calls David Coleman the most powerful educational administrator that no one's ever heard of. He's never been elected to public office. He's never taught a class. David Coleman has never taken an education course. He has no training in education. None. And yet he's the guy in charge of all of this. No sooner did the English and math standards get written by David Coleman than he immediately left Common Core, and you're going to love this. He somehow miraculously became the president of the college boards, where he is rewriting the SATs, you know, the exams your kids are going to have to take to get to college. He's rewriting them to conform to his Common Core standards. Do you see what we now mean by banana republic stuff? Stuff that happens in tin horn dictatorships. Who the heck is this guy? He has no qualifications. Nobody knows who he is. He's never been elected to any public office. He wrote the standards. Now he's rewriting the entrance exams to college to conform to the standards he wrote, and nobody knows who he is? This is a takeover. And so you've got 5 individuals in these 2 Washington lobbyist groups. Well, who paid for it all? That's Bill and Melinda Gates, right? And can I ask you, what are Bill Gates' qualifications? Isn't he the guy that dropped out of college because it was utterly worthless to what he wanted to achieve, opened a company in a garage and made billions of dollars? What qualifies Bill Gates to be in charge now, or bankrolling, to be one of the main idea men behind this transformation of education? The standards that are transforming American schools aren't owned by the public. They're not owned by the governors, they're not owned by the states. They're not owned by the moms and dads, or the teachers' unions. They're owned by private individuals who you have no control over. That should make you angry. Even if you think you like the standards, that should make you exceedingly angry. And you cannot allow it to stand. And the degree to which your state governors, people like the former Jeb Bush, your school administrators, are kowtowing to this. They're also selling your kids down the road for a handful of federal money. There's no other reason for it. 5 individuals, 2 Washington lobbyist groups. As you sit here today, Bill Gates has spent over $6 billion of his own money, $6 billion on Common Core. And all of that money didn't go to help educate a single student. It went to paying off educational companies, textbook companies, state governments to support the standards. Not to educate a single kid, but to buy support. There's not a single major educational organization in this country that supports Common Core that was not paid to do so by Bill Gates. All of them have been paid. The National PTA, who's supposed to be watching out for your kids, they received millions and millions of dollars in grants from Bill Gates to start advertising and promoting Common Core in states like Florida before the standards were even written, before anybody at the PTA had seen them. The NC, why did 170 Roman Catholic diocese schools? Our Catholic schools, and I'm Catholic, 20 years of Catholic school. This is an outrage. Why did our Catholic schools, which were already educating kids better than the public schools, why did they take Common Core the very first semester they could without being asked to? Could it be the NCEA, the National Catholic Education Association, the primary watchdog looking over our Catholic school kids? Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants from Bill Gates to the NCEA. And you know, right, the only thing Gates has spent more of his private money on than Common Core is abortion, eugenics, and birth control in Africa. That's a lovely partner for the Roman Catholic Church, isn't it, at the highest levels? But they took the money. This is where we sit today. Everybody, the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, all these 501c3s, you know, the purpose of these educational 501c3s, the Broad Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Achieve, ALEC, Inc., the purpose of these 501c3s has never been to improve your kids' education. It has been to politicize it. All of those groups, oftentimes funded by the George Soroses of the world, or the Bill Gateses of the world, all dedicated to politicizing, not improving American public education, and all of those groups have supported Common Core and have been paid to do so. And I ask you again, oh, you're Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, the Chief Educational Officer in the country. He's never been a teacher. He has no teaching classroom experience. And yet, his whole background, Arne Duncan, is not education, it's sociology. That's interesting, isn't it? Why would you put a sociologist in charge of the Department of Education? Unless you wanted to create a sociological, not an educational framework. And the dirty little secret is that's what Common Core is. Common Core was never intended to educate your kids better. In fact, it was designed to lower educational standards overall in the name of social justice. See, it's not fair. And you see how this absolutely supersedes, transcends race and class and gender and all the things people think this is about? Basically, the federal government does not believe any kid should know more than any other kid. That no kid should be able to go ahead of any other kid in any way. That's not fair. So what we're going to do is create a paradigm where every kid comes out common. That's the common in Common Core. We're going to make sure every kid knows the same thing. And can we just, for 1 second here, can we just do the math that your state schools won't do? And I'm going to stop calling them public schools now. From now on, I'm going to refer to them as government schools. Because there's nothing public about this. If they were public, you would have had the first say in whether you wanted this or not. You would have made that decision. You weren't even consulted. So your government schools now have decided that every kid is the same kid. No kid will supersede other kids. So let's do the math that our government schools won't do. If you're going to get 60 million American school kids to exactly the same place, is that going to be, by definition, a high place or a low place? Doesn't it have to be? I mean, my God, if you're going to get a guy like me in the NBA, and I fully vote, there's nobody who looks like me in the NBA, and it's an outrage, I tell you. No 5'7", slightly overweight, bald guys, slightly overweight, bald guys, who can't jump play in the NBA. So you want to get me in the NBA, you're going to rig it so that we have common NBA standards. What's going to happen to the overall level of play in the NBA? This is, and with that argument, it's kind of silly, but that's exactly the mindset here. Think about your own education. Everybody has strengths, right? Legendarily, I was good in reading and I was horrible in math. Well, so what? The world, last I checked, the world needs more than CPAs. The fact is that none of our kids are good at everything. We have a system, we've had for, one of the reasons America became a superpower is because of individual liberty, the freedom. It's my freedom not to care about math, if I can be really good at other things. That's what made us strong. We all have, but that's not right. That's not socially just. Social justice means every kid's got to be the same kid. And as you figured out, that means at a lower level of achievement across the board in everything. So you got Arnie Duncan in charge of the Department of Education, who's not a teacher. You've got 5 unaccountable, non-educational lobbyist groups who are behind the standards. 2 of them, I should say. 5 people in those groups. Right? The chief architect of whom, David Coleman, as you'll see in a moment, has no experience with this. Who's now running the college boards and transforming your kids' entrance exams to college. On what basis? None of this has anything to do with education. And I always like to ask this question too. Alright, so you're saying to yourself, we got 2 Washington lobbyist groups, 5 principal operators, a completely unqualified Secretary of Education, a very polemical president. But I don't see how this is federal. How did this get federal? Well, I don't care how much money Bill Gates got. He could not buy this into your public schools. He could buy teachers' unions, he could buy education companies, he could buy textbook publishers, but he couldn't buy this into your school. You've been watching your government, haven't you, for the last 40 years? Our federal government does not let strangers and unqualified people, can you imagine, right? Me being a bad mathematician, put me in charge of the committee to reform the IRS. That'd be great, right? But your federal government would not stand by and let this happen. The only force in this country who could have put Common Core in your schools was the federal government. And that was the Federal Race to the Top program. How many of you heard of that? Back in 2008 and 2009, when the outgoing Republican President Bush and the incoming Democrat President Obama said unless you cough up billions and billions of taxpayer dollars to bail out banks and car companies, the whole system was going to collapse. Do you know that the first year alone, over $1 billion of that mandatory stimulus package that was so necessary went right to the Department of Education? Didn't go to bail out anybody. They took your money under pretense of a crisis and they handed over $1 billion to the Department of Ed. And what did they do with it? They began to create the tests that would lead to Common Core. And I'll have the evidence for that in a moment. So they stole your money, made you think the whole world was coming to an end, then gave it to the Department of Education to begin this nasty process. One of the things they did was to create the Race to the Top program, which was called the stimulus of public education. And what they did is they urged every single state in the union, starting in 2009, to start applying for Race to the Top grants, basically just giveaways. I'll give you an example. In 2007, New York became the first state in the union to win a Race to the Top grant, not 2007, 2009. New York became the first state in the union to win a Race to the Top grant. They got $700 million from the feds. That money went right to the New York State Department of Education. They could spend it on anything they want, no restrictions. Cocktail parties, substitute teachers, tetherball, whatever they wanted to. And the only there were 2 meaningful stipulations. Any state, and 46 did, any state that took any Race to the Top money was obligated to accept the Common Core state standards when they were finally written. The vast majority, all of the 46 states that took it without even knowing what it was. Simply because in 2007, 2008, 2009, 10, and 11, they wanted that money. And there are even states like my state, Wisconsin, that did not win. Wisconsin became the first state in the union to take Common Core, and we never won a Race to the Top grant. But the minute Wisconsin took Common Core, hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 5 years started flowing in from all sorts of odd and untraceable federal accounts, right, to support, to propagate, to implement, right, to put in Common Core. That's how you got it. In other words, the federal government bribed 46 states to take a set of curriculum standards they really hadn't seen in return for your own money. That's why it's federal. And by the way, that's illegal. 3 different federal statutes dating from 1965 prohibit the federal government from creating national standards in education or a national curriculum. They are, and to say nothing of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits excessive federal meddling in state education autonomy when it comes to how you educate your kids. Legally, they couldn't do this. And people ask me all the time, see, this sounds like a conspiracy. If it's a conspiracy, it's the most in-your-face, obvious conspiracy in American history. And that's saying something. 3 different, why did they do it this way? If they just wanted to take over public education, why didn't they do it like they took over healthcare? Because legally, they could not. There was no legal impediment, no statutes on the books that in theory would have prevented them from doing healthcare. But there was with regards to the takeover of education. So they did the next best thing. They let these 5 individuals, all of whom had very deep ties to the Obama administration. These 5 individuals, they sheltered them under these 2 Washington lobbyist groups. They weren't members of those lobbyist groups. They had nothing to do, 5 people who did this had nothing to do with those lobbyist groups. Your federal government dumped millions of dollars into those lobbyist groups to pay them for sheltering these 5 people who wrote the standards. And then it was the federal Race to the Top program, the only thing that put it in your schools. And the shocking thing about that is, when they put it in your schools this way, I'm surprised it took this long. It took 6 years. We now have our first state governor who is in the process of suing the federal government for the illegality of this, and that's Bobby Jindal right next door in Louisiana. He recognizes that it is illegal. At last count, there were about 16 different state governors who were contemplating jumping on board with Bobby Jindal's lawsuit. Alas, your Rick Scott is not one of them. Right? That should hardly surprise, right? Jeb Bush would throw a conniption fit if he tried it. But 16 different state governors are considering this. It's kind of a big deal, because it is illegal. So they did the next best thing, they did an end round. And I always like to throw the argument out there that, do you think the people who support Common Core, the superintendents, the principals, the politicians, do you think they would still support it? If instead of Bill Gates and his $6 billion, it was the Koch brothers? Can you imagine if it were the Koch brothers who put up $6 million for Common Core? Would it not be on the front page of every newspaper every day? Rogue billionaire buys public education. But has anybody ever questioned Bill Gates' role in this? Well, yeah, tell me you haven't heard. A lot of you in this room have been fighting Common Core for years. Tell me you haven't heard this. The minute you oppose Common Core, they say you're being political. You're turning this into a political issue. So you fight back for something nobody asked for, and you're being political. Have you ever heard any of your newspapers, any of the news programs, any of your national pundits ever question the politics of the people who did this? Why is it only political when you fight back? They do something to you that is both illegal and immoral. And when you raise your voice about it, you're being political. No one asked this. It's been estimated that 70% of American school districts, 7 out of 10, particularly rural white school districts and highly ethnic inner city school districts, are going to have to spend a lot of money to upgrade their computer technology, bandwidth, to buy support and tech materials, to be able to administer the Common Core exams. Whose computers do you think are going in those schools? How come nobody's asking this? Never. Your newspapers are, but you knew this, not just grossly incompetent, they are absolutely dishonest on behalf of these big government transformations. They lied to you incessantly about Common Core. About Obamacare. They lied to you incessantly. And then only after it was in and couldn't be taken out did they remind you, oh yeah, it's true, you might not be able to keep your doctor. Yeah, and it is true, you may have to pay more in taxes. Same thing with Common Core, right? The only silver lining I've ever yet found in Common Core is that if it were the Koch brothers, I suppose, Harry Reid's head would explode all over the Senate floor. That'd be something to see. That's about it. Again, think about what would happen if you had, instead of a very conservative liberal president, you had a very conservative one who bribed 46 states with taxpayer money to take a set of standards nobody had seen, written by 2 right-leaning lobbyist groups instead of 2 left-leaning ones, paid for by a conservative billionaire instead of a liberal one. Do you honestly think your school administrators would stand by this? Do you honestly think the news press would allow it to happen? But that's where you are. That's how you got it. And they don't even really debate this. Whenever you bring this up to them, they'll say things like, can we just talk about the standards? Tell me one thing you don't like about the standards. I'll do that. I'll give you a lot of things not to like about them. But it is funny that how they did it doesn't matter now that they've done it. Let's talk about what we've done. And so the problems with Common Core started really, really, really early. Let's start with the 2 chief lawyers at the Department of Education. You know, the 2 guys that were hired by the Department of Education to make sure the department was not overstepping constitutionally its authority. Well, those 2 lawyers both said they were. With respect to the Race to the Top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education, concluded that, quote, these standards and tests, the assessment, will ultimately direct the course of secondary and elementary study in most states across the nation, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a national K-12 program and raising a fundamental question about whether the department is exceeding its statutory boundaries. Since they are no longer employed at the Department of Education, they have now written a 40-page white paper that you could read for free at the Pioneer Institute site online that will explain all the illegalities of Common Core. The whole thing was illegal. And I'm not sure why, but the very top part of the slide is cut off from the very bottom part. The very bottom part that's being cut off underneath New York State is where you'll go, and I'll send you all the slides. It's where you would go to verify this. On the slide, it's just getting cut off for some reason. So here's the thing. In all my years of doing this now, in all the states I've been to, the only argument I have ever heard about this information that I'm going to show you, the only fight that's ever taken place, they will not debate us. You cannot get somebody in the schools to come and stand next to us. They won't do it. You can't, and that's the other thing that you should be really suspicious about. Pretty much any day of the year, you can go somewhere in this state and find an anti-Common Core talk. All across the country, activists are doing these over and over again. Name for me one place you can go in the whole state of Florida where you're going to hear why Common Core is good. One public forum like this. They don't have them. The people who support Common Core are not telling you why they support it. You can't go to a meeting like this and have... If this is so obviously untrue what you're being told, they should be able to stand up there in 2 seconds and dispute it. They won't do it. So the only argument I have ever received, any of us have ever received, is the old tried and true one. If you oppose Common Core, you are simply a right-wing, teabagging, tinfoil hat-wearing Republican moron. You're a wingnut. That's the end of it. You've heard that argument?
The other one is that I've heard over and over again is, oh, you're not for standards?
That's good. Yes, remember that one? If you don't want, as if until 2009, we had no standards in American education. But you heard that before. Remember the Affordable Care Act? If you didn't support Obamacare, do you want people to die in the streets? Remember the last presidential election? You don't support the latest feminist agenda with regards to abortion? Oh my God, it's a war on women, right? And now with Common Core, you don't want our federal takeover of education, and you just don't want standards for your kids. These are the arguments. So okay, I decided, I think it was the smartest thing I ever did. The simple best way to fight this now is I'm going to show you why Common Core won't work exclusively from progressive left-wing voices. You give me a week, I'll make the conservative argument against Common Core with all the evidence. You give me a week, I'll make the Christian argument against Common Core with all the evidence. But of course, they're not going to count that. See what they do. If your evidence comes from conservatives, then it's a lie. Isn't it an amazing country we live in, where according to the media, your facts are only facts if you're a Democrat. It's just the way it is. All right, let's let the Democrats make the case. And so that's what the title of the slide would be. It's a liberal opposition to Common Core. All right, because they want you to think there is none. That guy right there is the superintendent of New York schools. John King Jr. He is the man who single-handedly brought Common Core to New York. Not the governor, didn't consult the legislature, didn't consult the teachers or the teachers' unions. He took money from Race to the Top, $700 million, and New York was on the hook. And notice the date of this, you can't see the date, it was
January 27th.
January 2014, a little over a year ago. The Board of New York's Teachers Union on Saturday, 27 January, unanimously voted to withdraw support from the Common Core state standards as they are being implemented, and they want John King Jr. fired. They want the guy who brought it to the state fired. The New York State United Teachers, a union that represents more than 600,000 educational professionals in the state of New York, is also asking the Board of Regents to remove King from office. And although the union previously backed the Common Core standards, they say they will not support the education benchmarks, quote, either as implemented or interpreted. Not the way you wrote them, and not if you try to fix them, the union said. You gotta get rid of them. And you understand what I'm telling you. Any way you want to try to spin the New York State Teachers Union as some kind of right-wing covert operation, right? How about, let's get bigger. How about the entire National Education Association? This one's dated from February of last year, 14 months ago. The nation's largest teachers union, and by the way, the NEA, just in case you weren't aware of it, this is the most progressive union in the country now. Now that the UAW has been kneecapped, they spend more money of their teachers' dues, their union dues, fighting for liberal political causes than any union in the country. When Governor Walker of Wisconsin got recalled a couple years ago for taking on the teachers' union and winning, that union dumped over $150 million of its teachers' dues to fight to get Walker ousted. So this is no right-wing group. And in February of last year, the nation's largest teachers' union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for the Common Core, labeling the rollout, quote, completely botched, unquote. National Education Association President Dennis Van Rokel said, quote, the standards will not succeed without a major course correction, which includes rewriting the standards and revising the tests with teacher input. Yes, you heard that right. The only way we have to measure Common Core is what goes in these national tests. There's nothing your teachers can do in the classroom. No test, no quiz, nothing they can do that's going to help. Because the only thing Common Core is measured by, your kids can be A students, bright and brilliant in the classroom. It doesn't matter if they don't do the Common Core test the way the Common Core people want them. And so that, by the way, is the second thing that genuinely makes Common Core federal and not state-led. Who controls the tests? All the information gathered on the exams, it doesn't report to Florida first. It doesn't report to your teachers. Your teachers never get any information from the federal government about how the kids in her class perform specifically. All that information goes to Washington, D.C.
What happens then if all of our students, teachers of our students, decide to have all of the students fail the Common Core testing?
Well, that's a problem. Why are the unions backing out? Now, you know, right, the unions haven't had a come-to-Jesus moment. Right? They're not all going to start voting for conservatives. The unions have figured out, however, that they don't control their teachers either. Who does? The feds. The people who control the tests. The reason your teachers won't, en masse, force your kids to fail them or ignore the tests, because your teachers will be evaluated, and their whole careers are determined by their promotions, their retention, if their kids perform the way the government wants them to on these tests.
And their salaries.
And their salaries, and whether they get hired in the first place. So the unions aren't on our side, but this is one of those cases where politics makes strange bedfellows, right? And what does it tell you? That left-wing progressive teachers unions who really don't like this country very much and who are very socialist, they think Common Core is too much government. What does that tell you? It's kind of a big deal, isn't it? And so this whole argument, right, that it's good people like you, right-wing tinfoil hat wearers, who are the only people who oppose this. Well, how about this? Oh, by the way, Dennis Van Rokel, he is no longer the president of the NEA. He lost last year in an election to a female candidate, and I just keep forgetting her name, a female candidate who ran on an anti-Common Core platform at the NEA. How about this? How about that's the nation's second largest teachers union? This is the American Federation of Teachers. By the way, believe it or not, the AFT is considered the more radical progressive of the two teachers unions. And so the date of this is March 2014, or excuse me, May 2014, 8 months ago, 9 months ago. In a major surprise, the American Federation of Teachers, the country's second largest teachers union, opened its convention by announcing a step back for support from Common Core. The AFT will now provide monetary grants to teachers who want to criticize the standards or even write new ones. That's big, because you remember the last slide about these tests. As the NEA points out, how do you hold teachers accountable? I'm all for teacher accountability. As a 22-year teacher, I think good teachers need to be rewarded and bad ones need to go. That's the problem with the unions. They may try to get more money for the good teachers, but they don't get rid of the bad ones. Nevertheless, the union's got a point. If teacher careers are now being evaluated primarily, if not exclusively, on these tests, how do you hold teachers accountable for tests they didn't write? As the union said, they didn't write the tests. No educators, no teachers, no professors were involved. And if the teachers didn't write the test, how do you hold teachers accountable for tests they have no control over? Tests they don't even get to see in many instances. You understand why the unions are nervous? They should be nervous. And look, if the unions are nervous about the feds on this one, we should be wetting our collective pants. Right? If the unions are that upset about what this means for them, what does it mean for you and your values, right? So this union, right, the more progressive, that's a big deal. They're actually going to pay what a racket. Collect ridiculous dues from your teachers, then dole some of it back out to the teachers to let them criticize the standards. This is a big deal. You just saw New York Teachers Union pull out, so you got a problem, Florida. Well, you got quite a few of them with regards to who's got running your state. But one of the big problems you've got is that the teachers unions in Florida, there's not, such as they are left, support Common Core. And the state wants Common Core. So if you're a teacher in these schools, how do you open your mouth? Who's going to protect you? Your union wants it, your state wants it. So if you open your mouth and they fire you, they refuse to read, and that's what's happening. I've got a folder at home this thick with over 1,000 letters that people in every state have given me when I've traveled. These letters are from superintendents, they're from principals, they're from teachers to teachers, threatening teachers, telling them, you have every right as an American to have a different view, but you do not have a right to be employed here and say it. These are all letters that threaten teachers. You will not talk about the standards. You will not attend meetings on Common Core publicly. You will not dissent from what we've done. They're not hiring teachers who aren't complete. I've seen resumes, right? We run a little school. We get resumes from public school teachers all the time who can't find work. And they're applying to our little Christian school, and they're advertising first and foremost how compliant they are to Common Core. Because they've been brainwashed into thinking they'll never get jobs anywhere, even though all over our education material is absolutely no Common Core. Shows you how brainwashed they are. What kind of a system is it where teachers who dislike it are not allowed to say it? The teachers are the primary contact between your kids and education. And they can't tell the truth? And so what happened in New York is a big deal. When the teachers union in New York backed out, guess what happened? Teachers who up till then had kept their mouths shut started speaking out in the thousands. Why? Because now if the state tries to fire them, the unions got their back. If one of those two things happened in Florida, right, the teachers union such as they are, came out and rejected this, you would see all kinds of teachers speak in their mind. But right now there's no possibility for them to do it. Am I saying if you killed Common Core tomorrow, all of your teachers would come out and say they hated it? No, but I'll bet you 70, 80% would come out and tell you that this was a nightmare. But you'll never hear from them. And then the audacity of your superintendent of schools, the audacity of some of your superintendents at lower levels telling you, I don't know what you're talking about, all our teachers love Common Core. That's like Gehrig saying, gee, all of our SS men just love the Luftwaffe. Right? I mean, I use that. I understand that's a loaded image there. But this is fascism. Isn't it? when the people who are the contacts between your kids and grandkids and the entire public school system, those teachers, cannot dissent, cannot speak their minds, cannot give you an honest opinion about Common Core. There's not that much difference in those two metaphors. So, I like the last sentence there. Common Core has also seen other opposition from the left as well, particularly from a new faction of almost 100,000 left-wing teachers who call themselves the Badass Teachers Association, many of whose members are also part of the AFT. So the BATS, this group, the Badass Teachers, progressive radical left-wingers, the number's over 150,000 now. And that group formed primarily to fight Common Core. They are standing, believe it or not, arm in arm with Tea Party groups. Those people are, to fight Common Core. And the main point of agreement between the BATS and the Tea Parties is what Common Core does to special needs kids and the kids who are already struggling in schools. The one-size-fits, this is typical socialism, right? The one-size-fits-all model. If you can't get to the one size because you're too weak or too slow or too developmentally challenged, you have to be cut off. Who was it that Mao starved to death? Who was it that Stalin purged? Who was it that those glorious Castro brothers, who President Obama is so eager to earn praise from, who's in their jails right now? The ones who wouldn't conform and the ones who couldn't conform. That's where the radical left and the radical right radically agree about the radical proposals of Common Core. And then you've got one of my favorites, the Chicago Teachers Union, Barack Obama's own backyard. This is something else. This is the most radically progressive city teacher union in the country. That's Karen Lewis. You can see her face there. By the way, this is from March of last year, right? It's about a year ago. That's Karen Lewis. She is the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. She is a card-carrying Marxist fanatic. If you bumped into Karen Lewis on the street and you said, "Hey, Karen, congratulations on being a socialist," she'd smile, "Thank you." And give me an example of her politics. She was going to run for mayor of Chicago last year, and she was going to run to the left of Rahm Emanuel. See, I didn't think you could get anything but dryer lint between the left and Rahm Emanuel, but she was going to give it a shot. In fact, the only reason she's not running for mayor of Chicago is because I think she developed cancer, so she's sick. So she's not running. But that would give me an example of the Chicago Teachers Union's radical politics. Do you know who their Martin Luther King Day speaker was for the elementary school students last year? The Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Yeah, there you go. So this is no right-wing group. And this is a direct quote. Here's what Karen Lewis of the CTU, and keep in mind that most of Karen Lewis's students are inner-city, ethnic minority kids who are already behind. Here's what Karen Lewis said. Quote, "I agree with educators and parents from across the country. Common Core mandate represents an overreach," and by the way, notice that she used the word mandate. "This wasn't voluntary. The Jeb Bushes of the world are on national TV in places like Iowa telling potential voters that states voluntarily took Common Core." Okay. "The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy." That's all the data gathering. "The Common Core mandate also represents an overreach of federal power into state educational autonomy. You have no local control." And I'm going to put my English professor hat on just once. All right? Kids, the word for the day is irony. I'm going to use it in a sentence. It is ironic that a Marxist socialist sees Common Core as too much government intervention. Isn't that? I mean, they don't come more leftist than Karen Lewis, and she's telling you this is way too much government.